What's Going On was released in May of 1971. It sold 100,000 copies in the first week. Within a year, it had moved 2 million units. It was reviewed as a masterpiece, a turning point. The record that proved soul music could carry the weight of an entire society's grief and ask the questions that no politician, no journalist, no institution had the courage to ask out loud. Marvin Gaye saw almost none of the money. Not because the money wasn't there, not because the label failed commercially, but because the contract Marvin Gaye had signed years earlier, the contract that governed every note he recorded, every tour he performed, every piece of his name that Motown used to build its empire, had been constructed in such a way that the money flowed in one direction, and one direction only, toward the institution, away from the man. This is not a story about bad luck. This is not a story about an artist who spent recklessly or planned poorly. This is a story about a system designed with precision, operated with consistency, and aimed at exactly the kind of person Marvin Gaye was, talented enough to generate enormous wealth and trusting enough to sign the document that ensured someone else would keep it. By the time the Internal Revenue Service came for Marvin Gaye, the debt had grown to a number that staggers the imagination. The details of how it got there tell you everything you need to know about what the American music industry was, and in many of its essential structures, still is. Motown Records was founded by Gordy in Detroit in 1959. The founding mythology is well known, a black-owned label built from the ground up that took Detroit's working-class talent and turned it into a global phenomenon. The story of Motown as triumph, as a monument to black entrepreneurship and creative genius, is not false, but it is incomplete, because inside the triumph was a mechanism, and the mechanism worked like this. Motown did not pay its artists royalties in the conventional sense. It paid advances. The distinction sounds technical. It was not technical. It was everything. An advance is money given before earnings are calculated. It must be paid back, recouped in industry language, before an artist sees a single dollar of actual profit. And at Motown, the list of expenses that counted against an artist's recoupment was extraordinary. Studio time, session musicians, arrangers, producers, promotional costs, publicity photographs, tour support, travel, accommodation, the cost of manufacturing the physical record, the cost of shipping it, even in some cases, the cost of the office staff who process the paperwork. Every dollar spent on making, marketing, and selling a Marvin Gaye record was charged to Marvin Gaye's account, not to Motown, not shared proportionally, to Marvin. And the royalty rate against which all of this was measured, the percentage of each sale that would eventually, theoretically, flow back to the artist once recoupment was achieved, was set at a number that made recoupment extraordinarily difficult to reach. Marvin Gaye was earning, in his early Motown years, royalty rates that industry analysts would later describe as among the lowest of any major artist of his commercial stature in that era. He was Motown's most valuable asset. He was told, consistently, that he was family. He signed whatever was put in front of him. Not because he was foolish, but because he was 20 years old when the relationship began. He had no legal representation that was independent of Motown's interests, and the alternative to signing was not signing, which meant no recording, no distribution, no audience, and no career. The contract was the only door, and Berry Gordy had built it. What Marvin Gaye did not know, what almost none of Motown's artists knew, because the contracts were not designed to be understood by the people signing them, was that the system had a compounding quality. The debt did not stay still. It grew. It grew while he was recording. It grew while he was touring. It grew while he was sleeping. And by the time the Internal Revenue Service entered the picture, the debt had grown so large that no amount of recording, no level of success, no commercial achievement of any kind was going to be enough to outrun it. Act 3. Conflict. The IRS did not arrive suddenly. The debt accumulated over years, quietly in the background of a career that looked, from the outside, like one of the most successful in American music. While Marvin Gaye was winning Grammy Awards, his tax liability was climbing. While his albums were being called masterpieces, the government was building a case file. While audiences were filling arenas to hear him sing about what was going wrong with America, the machinery of the American financial system was methodically dismantling everything he had. The problem had multiple sources, and it is important to understand each of them, because together they form a picture not of personal failure, but of institutional entrapment. First, Motown's accounting system. The label controlled the books. Artists had limited independent ability to audit what they were owed, what had been recouped, what remained outstanding. The figures Marvin received were the figures Motown chose to give him. His actual earnings, the real numbers behind the advances and the recoupment calculations, were not fully visible to him. Second, the divorce. Marvin Gaye's marriage to Anna Gordy, Berry Gordy's sister, 17 years his senior, ended in 1977 after 14 years. The settlement was catastrophic. Marvin was ordered to pay Anna a sum that, given the state of his finances and the opacity of Motown's accounting, he could not actually produce in cash. His solution, recording the album Here, My Dear, and signing over all its royalties to Anna as part of the settlement, was creative, bitter, and ultimately insufficient. The album was a commercial disappointment on release. The royalties it generated did not cover what he owed, and the debt from the divorce compounded directly on top of the debt already accumulating from the tax liability. Third, the spending. Marvin Gaye lived expensively, not in the way the music industry mythology tends to frame it, not recklessly, not stupidly, but in the way that a man lives when he has been told his entire career that the money is coming, that the recoupment will resolve, that the next record will clear the balance. He believed the machine would eventually pay out. He was wrong. By the end of the 1970s, Marvin Gaye owed the Internal Revenue Service an amount that had grown, with interest and penalties, past $4 million. $4 million. In today's money, closer to $20 million. And the fundamental injustice at the center of it? The vast majority of the income from which that tax liability derived had passed through Marvin Gaye's hands so briefly, so partially, so filtered through Motown's recoupment machinery that he had never truly possessed it. He was being taxed on money he had earned but never received. The IRS does not make this distinction. The IRS looks at what was generated in an artist's name and asks for its share. What the label kept, what the contract permitted, what the accounting obscured, none of that is the government's concern. The bill belonged to Marvin Gaye, and it was going to be paid. In 1981, Marvin Gaye left the United States. He went first to Hawaii, then to London, then eventually to Ostend, a small coastal city in Belgium that had no particular connection to American soul music and no particular reason to be the place where one of the greatest voices of the 20th century tried to put himself back together. He was broke in the specific way that only the very successful can be broke, surrounded by the evidence of enormous earnings, unable to access any of them. The departure was, in part, a tax exile. Living outside the United States complicated the IRS's ability to collect immediately. It bought time, not much, not permanently, but enough. It was also something else, something harder to categorize in financial terms. It was a man who had spent his entire adult life inside a system that had taken everything he produced and returned to him a fraction of its value, trying, for the first time, to simply be somewhere that system could not immediately reach him. What he found in Belgium was not peace. He found a mattress on the floor of a borrowed apartment. He found a drug habit that had moved well past recreational into something that required management just to function. He found a telephone that rang with calls from lawyers and accountants and creditors he did not have the resources to satisfy. And he found a synthesizer. The recordings he made in that apartment, demos, sketches, fragments of melody built on a basic keyboard in a room that smelled like the sea, would eventually become Sexual Healing, the song that brought him back, the song that gave CBS Records, his new label after he had finally, definitively broken from Motown, its biggest hit in years. It won him 2 Grammy Awards. It restored his commercial standing. It proved that the voice still worked, that the talent had survived the years of damage. And the IRS was waiting for him when he came home. There is a specific cruelty in what happened next. Marvin Gaye returned to America, restored, commercially viable, recording again. And the success of Sexual Healing did not solve the debt problem. It intensified it. Because success meant income, and income meant the IRS had something new to collect against. The comeback was real. The debt was realer. And the man who had just proven once again that he was one of the greatest artists alive was going to spend his final years running from a number that kept growing no matter how fast he moved. The Sexual Healing Tour ran through 1983 and into 1984. Marvin Gaye performed in arenas across America, Canada, and Europe. The shows were extraordinary by all accounts. Voice intact, presence magnetic. The kind of performance that reminded audiences why they had loved him in the first place. And backstage, before and after every show, there was a man who was frightened in a way that went beyond normal performance anxiety. He had received threats. Letters, specific, detailed, credible enough that his security team treated them seriously. The nature of the threats has never been fully disclosed publicly. What is known is that Marvin Gaye took them seriously, that he traveled with significant security, and that the combination of the threats, the unresolved debt, the drug use, and the relentless pace of the tour had produced a state of sustained, unbroken fear that people close to him described as unlike anything they had seen from him before. He told people in this period that he did not believe he would survive the year, not as prediction, as conviction. The kind of certainty that a man arrives at when the weight of what is accumulating around him becomes too specific, too multi-directional, too consistent to dismiss. He owed money he could not pay, being threatened by people he could not identify. He was using cocaine at a level that his body was beginning to struggle to accommodate. He had moved back into his parents' house in Los Angeles, a man in his mid-40s, one of the most celebrated artists in the history of American music, sleeping in the house where his father had beaten him as a child. Think about what that means. The full weight of it. Marvin Gaye had spent his entire life trying to escape that house, through music, through marriage, through Motown, through Belgium, through the Grammy podium, through every stage in every arena where the audience's love was so loud it temporarily drowned out everything else. And at the end, when the debt was unpayable and the threats were real and the body was failing, he came back to the beginning. He came back to his father's house, and his father was still there. The next morning, April 1st, 1984, Marvin Gaye Sr. walked into his son's bedroom and shot him once in the chest. He was 44 years old. One day before his birthday. The IRS debt was still outstanding. The threats were unresolved. The Motown royalties that should have made him wealthy beyond the reach of any of this were still, largely, sitting in accounts he had never fully controlled. None of it mattered anymore. After Marvin Gaye died, the financial picture became slightly clearer and significantly more enraging. His estate, such as it was, went through a probate process that revealed what the years of Motown accounting had obscured. The gap between what Marvin Gaye had generated and what Marvin Gaye had received was staggering. The back royalties owed to his estate, money that should have been paid during his lifetime, money that the label's recoupment calculations had absorbed or deferred or categorized in ways that kept it out of Marvin's hands, took years to untangle. His children and his mother eventually received settlements. The figures were not made fully public. In the decades since his death, Marvin Gaye's catalog has generated revenues that are almost impossible to calculate with precision. Licensing fees, streaming royalties, sample clearances, film and television placements, advertising use. His voice has been used to sell cars, perfume, and airline tickets. Let's Get It On has been licensed so many times in so many contexts that it has become almost architectural, a permanent feature of the American commercial soundscape. The systems that were built to harvest his earnings during his lifetime continue, in modified form, to harvest his earnings after it. The heirs receive more than he did. That is the bar against which improvement has been measured. Gordy has spoken warmly about Marvin Gaye in interviews conducted since his death. He has described him as a genius, as a visionary, as the greatest artist Motown ever produced. He has not addressed in any specific or accountable way the contractual structures that ensured that genius generated wealth primarily for the institution rather than the man. The industry that built those structures has reformed itself in some respects and preserved itself in others. The fundamental power imbalance between the institution that controls distribution and the artist who creates the product has not been resolved. It has been rebranded. What's Going On asked a question. Marvin Gaye spent his entire career asking questions about war, about poverty, about the gap between what America promised and what America delivered. He asked them in music because music was the only place the questions were allowed to live at full volume. The question nobody asked, not loudly enough, not with enough consequence, was about him, about what the system was doing to the man even as it celebrated the voice, about the distance between the Grammy podium and the IRS debt, about the contract signed by a 20-year-old and enforced against a 44-year-old, about the royalties that generated wealth for decades and found their way in full to the wrong set of hands. The music survived. It will always survive. The tape does not care about recoupment schedules or tax liability or the internal accounting of institutions that have since rebranded themselves beyond recognition. The tape holds the voice exactly as it was, warm, searching, asking, insisting on being heard. But the man behind the voice spent his final years in his father's house with an unpayable debt and a certainty that he was not going to make it to 45. He was right about that. He was right about most things. That was always the problem. The world kept asking him to sing about what was wrong, and never quite got around to fixing any of it. What's really going on? Now you know.